I was born in South Wales, in Cardiff, in my grandmother's home. My mother had always been, well, she was a teacher, but apart from that, she used to go around doing music hall recitations of God knows what, along with the singers. And she always had wished to be on the stage, but it never actually happened. So she married, went to Hereford, which is just over the water from Cardiff, and went back to Cardiff to have me. So I was actually born on the banks of the River Taff. My grandmother's house was along the embankment, and the other side was the Taff. And since they call Welsh people Taffies, I am really entitled to be called a Taffy. So there I was, a little girl in Hereford, my mother longing to be on the stage. So of course she taught me to recite, and whenever my mother was too busy to go and perform, little 2-year-old and 3-year-old Vivienne would go and perform at the Mothers' Union or wherever. And I'm told that at that time, my first observation was when they tried to take me home after I'd recited. No, I wouldn't go home because I hadn't yet had my cup of tea, and all actors get a cup of tea. So I guess I learned how to ask for my payment quite early on. And then we moved around a lot, and of course the war came in 39, and I was still yearning for theatre, and I did win a scholarship to the Webber Douglas School, but alas, it came down with the German bombs, so I couldn't go there. And I had the chutzpah to go to a concert with Dame Sybil Thorndike and her husband, Lewis Casson, and get myself backstage to their dressing room and ask her, please, Miss Thorndike, I won this award and it's closed down, what can I do to get on the stage? And she said, oh, Lewis, she said to her husband, isn't Barry Jackson starting a school in the Birmingham Rep? I think so. Give me your details, dear, and I'll give them to him. And she did. And I got into the Barry Jackson School, which was condensed because of all of us got called up to go into the army at 18. So there we were, mostly 16s and 17-year-olds. And we worked morning till night, 9 o'clock in the morning, we'd start classes. And we were taught by performers in the theatre. And then at night we would either understudy or be assistant stage managers. So we worked from 9 in the morning till 11 at night when I got home. And that was Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. I think we had every other Sunday morning off, I think. But I know that on Mondays, we got Monday morning off because the theatre was closed on Mondays. So we had a little time to ourselves. And I finished that course and got my first job when I was 16, was still 16. I had my 17th birthday with my first performance as Boy Babe in Babes in the Wood. That was my first professional role and went on from there. Of course, because of the war, by the time I was 18, I had to be performing for the troops. That was the law, and with ENSA, or else I had to go into the Army, Navy, Air Force, or land as a land girl. But ENSA employed me, and we went from Army, Navy, Air Force, 3 or 4 performances a day. We didn't know exactly where we were. We were given a post office in the closest town to the area we were at, where we could receive our mail from our parents and send our mail. And so I did that till the end of the war, performing, enjoyed it very much. And then I went into repertory and went up to London, as most people did then, looking for work and getting it in various places. And by that time, I don't know why, but I seem to have got myself a reputation as a good stage manager. So I managed to get a lot of work stage managing as well as performing, which was helpful, I guess, because it kept me working more than I might have been otherwise. But at 18, I was always an organizer as well as a performer. I loved performing, but I became the chair of the Ben Uri Art Gallery's theatre division, and as that, I used to bring in plays by the people who wanted to try out, that they were beginning to write, with actors that I got to who were in West End plays that I managed to get to come and perform in them. How I did it, I don't know, but that's one of the things that I did. And and by the time when I was 19, I became the Actors Union's delegate to the trade union, to the British Trade Union. So I don't know how it happened, but that's what I was at that age. And I was able to talk for the whole of the theatrical profession. How I could, I don't know, but they trusted me, and that's what I did. And then later, when we had a club in London called the First Floor Club, where all we theatre people would get together and have cheap meals and get to know each other. And there I met a woman called, well, never mind her name, it won't come to me because of my silly mind, but I can see her face in front of me. And she was living in a place called on Frobovia Road in Earl's Court that had a lot of theatre people living in there. She had a little 2-room flat there, and she got me in there, hooray, in a 1-room up on the 4th floor. I had to go down 2 floors to get to the bathroom, but it was wonderful. It was full of theatre people. And I lived there, got jobs from there, and then when I was 20, I met a lot of Jewish people from India. The owner of this place was an Indian Jew, and he had a son who married my friend's friend. So I got into the circle, and somehow from that circle, I ended up trying to make a decision: should I have an affair with one of them or should I marry the other? And my silly friends told me to marry the other. And he said, "You'll have to do it right away because I'm going to Canada." So I took him home. We got married in my home, and off we came to Canada. That's how I got here, of all things. I've arrived in Canada, and I'm not happy in that marriage at all. But I did manage to, quite soon after I came, getting a job with Dora Maver Moore in the First Play Society as a stage manager, because I'd done a lot of stage managing in London, and stage managers were hard to find here. And I've stage managed for plays with people like Don Harron and that, you know, and that was how I sort of got into things. And I met a woman who was a folklorist, Edith Folk, a very famous folklorist who has many books out, and she had a program on CBC. And oh yes, I did do a lot of CBC work at that time. I got into, I acted in quite a few plays on CBC radio. Then and that's what I was doing when I met Edith Folk, and I was helping her with this folklore program that she had on radio, and she said, "Oh dear, the Weavers have got together again, Pete Seeger and the Weavers, and they can't perform in the States because they're blacklisted, but they could perform in Canada, and I can't find anybody to bring them in." And I said, "I will." And that's how I became a producer. I brought the Weavers here, and then I brought a whole lot of other performers, Josh White, Pete Seeger by himself. The names won't come to me, but lots of well-known names from that time. Big enough or known enough to take to the bigger place at Massey Hall, I took there, the Eaton Auditorium. And I did a lot of producing at that time of concerts. When was that? That was during the time that there was CBC was on Jarvis Street, and a lot of us used to meet and talk in the lounge in CBC. That's how we got together and got to know each other. And as I said, I did a lot of CBC radio. Then when TV came, I was interviewed and photographed to see if I'd be any good for TV. And they said that the information they got from the files about me was, I said that I was very good at accents of people from various areas of Britain and various countries, that this was something I could do. And apparently whoever had done these interviews of me when I first started for radio had said that all my accents were good except my Welsh accent, which was a little off. They obviously didn't know that I was born in Wales and that it was my real accent, like that all I was doing was talking like I did when I was a child. But they didn't seem to know that, you know. So that's what happened, and then I got a few parts in TV, but I was still doing my work, showing people, bringing people in as a producer. Apparently I must have been pretty good at it, because a guy who wanted to start doing production from Ottawa, Harvey Glatt, he came to see me while I was doing it and said that the production companies that he was trying to get performers from in New York had suggested that he come and find out how to do it from me, because they said I did it very well. So New York thought highly of me as a producer. That's how I discovered it. And then Harvey Glatt and I got together with the man who was the representative of Folklore's Records in Montreal. And we would bring shows to all the three cities. That way we were able to get a good price by bringing them to all three. We got together on that. Ultimately, knowing this man whose name won't come to me, who was in Montreal working for Folkways, Edith Folk got in touch with him and said, you should make a recording of Vivienne doing British folk songs, British folk tales before they get lost, because she knows them. So they made this record of me doing folk tales. I think the second or the third printing was changed to 101 folk stories. My original one for the first one was called As I've Heard Tell. So that is now it's in the Smithsonian. I was Vivienne Stenson, because that was the name of that was his name, and that's the one that I came to Canada with. I don't know how I got from one to another, but I was always somehow involved with people who were doing wonderful work, and it was somehow that always happened to me. Among the things I produced was I brought the Royal Welsh Male Voice Choir on a tour of North America, starting in Toronto. In that choir, there was a man who was the uncle of Richard Burton. And Richard Burton was going to perform, the opening performance of the O'Keeffe Centre was going to be this play in which Richard Burton was starring. So naturally, as a good publicist, I took his uncle to Richard Burton's dressing room while Richard Burton was making up, and we got him interviewed for newspapers and magazines and television, so that I could get more people coming to the concert of the Royal Welsh Male Voice Choir. And it was too successful, because a lot of people tried to come in to the reception after the concert. People tried to come who were not invited, and I had to work with the manager of the restaurant at which we were having that reception to try to keep out people who were not invited to have a glass of wine with Richard Burton and my choir, of course. And so that was quite hard work. And at the end of it, I had to go and pay for the work, for the restaurant. So the manager invited me into his office to go over the books and to pay. And I sat in his office and we went over the books. And then he said to me, could I see you home? That was the manager of that restaurant. So we walked up from there, College Street, up to just north of my home then was a house on Collier Street, which isn't there now because it's part of the library. So when we got there, he said, oh, I've enjoyed talking to you so much, I wish we could go on talking. I said, well, if you really mean that, there's a folk club that I know that's open up there. So we went to that folk club and talked all night. And that's the man I married. And he was on his way to New York, just as I'd been, as my first husband had been on his way to Toronto. So after a while, we got married. And in fact, the last concert that I did in Toronto, I was already in New York when I did it, and somebody else had to look after it for me in Toronto. And at that time, he had a friend who lived in Queens on Northern Boulevard. And this man and his wife were moving to another apartment, and they rented us their apartment furnished. So that's where we started. And I sort of knew people, and Bobby Glatz, who I'd been working with from Ottawa, had led me to people in the village. And I started a children's theatre in a restaurant in the village. So that the children would come and they would see this little play, and they would have their parents would leave them there while they went shopping elsewhere. So that's how I started to get back doing things in New York. But after all, of course, that wasn't enough really money to live on. I'd done a lot of advertising stuff. I don't know, I didn't mention that before, but in Toronto, I was managing to do advertising. And I honed in on that and got myself a job with a well-known underworld people. But in New York, I ended up, I got this job as a writer, and from that, I eventually got myself, firstly, the dinner director of Americans for Democratic Action. I had to run the whole thing, and I put on. I got a big dinner going and organized that whole thing and got people from all over the country. And apparently, he told me that it was because of what I'd pushed for the Teachers Association, wanting them to give us another vice principal, that caused him to ask me. And so it went on from there. So there I was. Washington was in charge, and Washington told me who across the country I should talk to, got them all there, did these things every year at a big hotel in New York. And that's what I did for several years. And then I got to, as I said, from there, I was recommended for the Reinhold Niebuhr Award, giving awards to the people who were honest in public service. And that was what I was doing quite happily when I one day took my children home, taking my children home from school. We came across a policeman kneeling with a loaded gun, I think it was loaded, over somebody he'd caught who was on the floor with his hands up. And I thought, I don't want my children to see this. I'm going back to Canada. So I came and talked to people I knew in Canada here, and I got myself a job as publicity director for the Art Gallery of Ontario. And that's what I was doing when I came back. It was the beginning of dinner theatre happening in restaurants all over. I started to do dinner theatre and bringing people into restaurants performing. One of those performances that I did was with Salome Bay. She was very successful in that, even though I had problems with a man that she became friendly with, who, after we were doing very well, and I had a very well-known Canadian jazz band performing, and he persuaded her to fire them and to have people from New York, which I didn't agree with, but anyway, despite all our problems, they thought that one of our performers was not black enough and made us get somebody else. So I lived through all that and lived through it with her to a point where when they started doing the Dora Awards, we were given she was given the first Performers Dora Award and I was given the first Director's Dora Award. Oh. And that's how that started. There were 3 women doing a show called Heaven Will Protect the Working Girl. And they had the idea for the show, and they came to me and asked me to put it together. And I did. And we put it on at a little club. And then that was the year of, for some women, it was the anniversary of some big women's event from many years before. So it was decided with that name that we'd be a good performance for Rideau Hall celebration of this 50th anniversary, I think it was, of whatever the women had managed to do for themselves, getting into Parliament or something. But whatever it was, we were invited to bring the show to Rideau Hall. And it was a big success. I remember driving in to the Rideau Hall and saying to the commandant who greeted us at the door, nobody stopped us and asked us who we were on the way in. I'm a little upset by that. How could you let us in not knowing who we were? They said, oh, we knew who you were. We were following you right from the station. So that was great. We did this big production in Rideau Hall, and it got in all the papers, and I'm very proud of that. Well, Don Cullen was the director of that play for me. Don Cullen was the man who owned a club that discovered Margaret Atwood and lots of other people. And he was on the board of a company trying to start a home for performing artists in Toronto. And he asked me to come on that board, along with Patty Gale was on it, and a few other people, well-known people. And so I went on this committee that was trying to create what eventually became PAL Toronto. And that, we met in Pierre Burton's office, which was on a street a little farther from here. And eventually we built PAL Toronto. Took us about 5 years, I think, from then. And I remember being at the opening and thinking I could never live here. The rooms are too small. At that time, I had an apartment in North York, which was a huge living room. But eventually, when my husband passed away, I came here, and I've never been happier. It's been wonderful being part of this place, being part of its growth, and then being one of the people who, among many other people who had their minds available outside of their performance to do things for PAL. And I've had many jobs while I've been here, quite apart from having done a little bit more TV and things, and writing and winning awards for writing short stories, things like that. And as I've just been reminded, I got an award for lifelong achievement from the art gallery from the arts. What do we call it? What do we call the organization? Canadian.
The Canadian actors, lifetime
Performing art.
Yeah.
Performing arts. Anyway, I got it.
You got lifetime achievement.
Yeah.
And you also
and I think the person who pushed me for that was John Karastamasis. And I think he told them at the time that it wasn't just for the work I was doing that he was recommending me, but because I thought of other people and tried to help them with what they were doing. So I'm very proud of the fact that that was the reason I got it, was not only for the work I did, but because I tried to help other people do their work, and that to me is important.